In the early 19th century, a man moved his wife and family to a small community of Red River in Robertson County, Tennessee. They lived peacefully on the settlement for about 13 years, but eventually found themselves in dire straits when they began to be followed by an unknown evil entity. These events were so terrifying and widespread that even former President Andrew Jackson also found himself believing this legend.
Attention, everyone. Get ready to be blown away by the hair-raising story of the notorious Bell Witch. Even after 200 years, this paranormal legend never fails to fascinate Americans with its horrifying hauntings and terrifying ghostly sights. Hold on tight, my dear Moonlight Haunts audience, because this tale has undergone countless changes and variations over time. I've meticulously gathered multiple reports to craft a bone-chilling story that will send shivers down your spine. Buckle up and prepare yourself for an eerie expedition into the haunting realm of the Bell Witch.
John Bell was an American farmer who grew up in Halifax County, North Carolina. He was raised to be a very hard worker as he took care of the farm and looked after their home. He had been a barrel maker apprentice for many years, but later followed his passion and started his own farm after realizing it was a profitable business. In 1782, he would marry a kind, gentle girl named Lucy Williams, and they soon settled on a farm that he previously purchased, and they would prosper as the area's best planters for nearly 20 years. At the time of the marriage, she was only 12 years old and he was 32, but hey, this was a different time. Over time, they eventually had 7 children together named Jesse, John Jr., Drury, Benjamin, Esther, and Zodiac. However, Benjamin unfortunately died at a young age, and Zodiac later moved to Mississippi away from the family as he got older. In the winter of 1804, John set his sights on new ambitions. He relocated with his family to a Red River community in Robertson County, Tennessee to start a whole new life and build a homestead. This area was located in a bottomland near the actual Red River, so the climate was always relatively humid and wet year-round. The land that John purchased was initially 328 acres, but over the years, his children began to get married and start their own families, so they began building their houses along the property, which soon spanned across 1,000 acres. For the next 13 years, life was going perfectly for John and his family. He continued his hobby as a farmer, had 3 other children named Betsy, Richard, and Joel, and he even became an elder at the local Red River Baptist Church, so he became a very respected individual for his morals and wisdom. However, the next 4 years spanning from 1817 to 1821 would mark a chapter of pure terror for the Bell family. It all started one day in 1817. John was tending the garden around his house as usual when he suddenly noticed a very strange-looking animal sitting in the middle of a stalk of corn. It looked like the corpse of a dog with the head of a dog. John saw this immediately and trembled. He had worked on a farm for many years and knew that this was no ordinary animal. He suddenly picked up a rifle and started shooting at the animal. But he couldn't hear it. It just broke. He disappeared into thin air. However, John didn't know what to do, and finally convinced himself that he was just bored and probably hallucinating. So he let it go. That same night, as the family sat down to eat dinner together, they suddenly heard a strange sound. The noise continued outside the walls of their hut. Therefore, their first thought was that someone was trying to break in. John and his son rushed out to see if they could catch the criminal. But there's nothing, there was absolutely no one outside. These noises persisted at around the same time every single night, getting louder and more forceful with each passing day, but every time John and his sons went out to investigate, they always came back empty-handed. In the following weeks, these strange phenomena eventually shifted onto John's children. They would often be awoken by strange, unsettling noises during the night that sounded like rats gnawing on their bedposts. They also heard this pounding on the ceiling, as if someone were banging their hand against it. As these nights went on, even more noises started to occur, including the sound of furniture being knocked over, chains being slowly dragged across the floor, and someone being choked and strangled in their bedroom. Obviously, the children were not getting good sleep during the night, and they kept complaining to their father about the noises, but he was completely lost on what to do. He had no idea what was happening, so unfortunately, the kids were just forced to. In the coming nights, things got much more intense. The children would be repeatedly woken up to their bed sheets being pulled off of them and their pillows being tossed onto the floor. Things began to get serious as the events escalated, from their hair being pulled to their skin being scratched in the middle of the night by a seemingly invisible entity. By this point, the family is already completely terrified. However, things were about to get much worse. In the weeks following the nighttime incidents, the family began to hear these faint whispers that weren't audible enough to make out any words, but they sounded like an old frail woman creepily singing hymns. Over time, John's youngest daughter Betsy eventually became the focal point of the hauntings. For some reason, whatever was tormenting this house really did not like her. She experienced the most violent of encounters, including the hair pulling, but she was also slapped around, beaten, and stuck with pins. There were visible slashes, hand marks, and bruises that were left all over her body and face. Initially, John had the family swear to never let these occurrences get out to the public. Because after all, they had a reputation. He was the elder priest and didn't want to be looked at as the freak who was haunted by an evil spirit. But due to the escalated circumstances, he eventually let his closest friend and neighbor in on the situation. His name was James Johnston, and he had a wife who was equally close with the Bell family. From what the Bells had told them, they were extremely concerned for their safety but also a little skeptical. So as any good friends would, they tried to help out as best they could. James and his wife ultimately agreed to stay the night at the Bell home, and for the entire evening, absolutely no activity occurred. That is, until they finally decided to go to sleep for the night. As James and his wife were sleeping in one of the guest bedrooms, their bed sheets were suddenly yanked off of them like the children several nights ago. James was suddenly slapped in the face, which woke him up in an instant. In a sleeping stupor, he sprang out of bed horrified, exclaiming in the name of the Lord, "Who are you and what do you want?" To which there was no reply. After this occurrence, nothing else happened for the rest of the night. And the next morning, James told John he believed there was indeed an evil spirit haunting this house. But just like John, he was dumbfounded on what to do about it. Over the next couple of years, the entity became much more active, having full-blown conversations with the family, quoting scripture, and singing hymns. It also seemed to have an extreme fondness for John's wife Lucy, claiming she was the most perfect woman that walked the earth. So she was extremely nice to her but seemed to have some personal vendetta against John. On one famous occasion, there were two churches holding a sermon at the same time located 13 miles apart from each other. And at the Bell house, the voice of the unknown entity recited each of them word for word at the same time in an almost ghostly, overlapping manner. This then sparked the belief that the entity was omnipresent, able to be in multiple places at once. One night following this occurrence, a family friend of the Bells, William Porter, was sleeping in his cottage nearby. He claimed that during the night, the entity attempted to get in bed with him, which he quickly bundled inside of his blanket. He attempted to throw it into his fireplace, but due to its extremely heavy weight and rancid smell, William eventually let go of the blanket, allowing it to escape. Now, the Bells' homestead was also a slave plantation. They had many slaves working the land, and one of their favorites and most trusted was an African American man named Dean. He, along with many of the other slaves, would encounter this entity in the form of a ferocious large black dog, sometimes appearing with two heads. It would viciously attack these slaves in dog form and out of dog form, where they were beaten and tortured profusely. In one remarkable event, Dean even claimed that at one point the entity had turned him into a mule, where he chaotically wandered across the land. By this point, nobody in the area was safe. Neighbors kept being attacked and visitors to the property would be scared away, so this is really when word started to spread outside of the Red River community. In fact, the townspeople began coming up with their own theories as to who was tormenting the Bell family, and these ranged from, "Oh, they're just all making it up because they want attention," to believing it was some Native American curse. However, most believe it was the work of a woman named Kate Batts. Kate Batts was a citizen of the Red River community, but she was treated like an outcast due to her eccentric nature. People claimed that she talked weird and was a practitioner of black magic or witchcraft due to the strange things that she would talk about and the way that she acted. She actually had a past history with John after her husband's brother got into a dispute with him over the sale of a slave. The situation eventually got heated and the Bell and Batts families were no longer on good terms. This is the reason that many people believed she had a hand in the strange occurrences that they had been experiencing, but whenever she was confronted with accusations, she claimed she had nothing to do with them. Almost the entire town subscribed to this belief and they eventually began referring to the entity as simply Kate. Later in 1819, after word had spread outside of the Red River community, people as far as Nashville were talking about these occurrences. Future President General Andrew Jackson happened to be in the town, and after hearing all this commotion, he became extremely interested in the haunting. Surprisingly, Andrew Jackson had already become acquainted with John and his 3 oldest sons after they fought under him in the Battle of New Orleans. Eager to investigate, he set up an entourage of several men, horses, and a large wagon to go down and inspect the Bell's property. When his entourage arrived, they began approaching the house when suddenly the wagon became lodged in a muddy creek bed. As his men attempted to maneuver the horses to pull the wagon, the loud, shrill voice of the entity suddenly penetrated their eardrums. It said it would allow them to pass, but if they chose to stay, she would later return that night once again. Even though the entourage was terrified out of their minds, Jackson was still determined to figure out what was going on here. So they eventually made their way up to the Bell property and set up their tents in John's backyard after receiving permission. And as night fell, Jackson told war stories to keep his men calm. There happened to be one cocky individual who claimed that he was a witch tamer. He pulled out his shiny pistol in a proud manner, claiming that it contained a silver bullet that could kill any spirit it came in contact with. He even bragged, claiming that the entity hadn't shown up because it was scared of him and the silver bullet. But right as he finished his sentence, he started screaming as his body violently jerked around, exclaiming he was being stuck with pins and being beaten relentlessly. He was then thrown straight out of the front of his tent. The witch suddenly spoke up, claiming that the cocky man was a fraud and that she would soon deal with the next fraud among their group. At this point, the men were completely frozen in fear and wanted to leave immediately. However, Jackson insisted that they stay to see who the other fraud was. Nobody knows what happened after this point, but it is known that the next morning, Jackson and his men were spotted in Springfield after leaving the Bell house. Perhaps something happened that truly shook Jackson to his core, because he allegedly stated, "I would rather fight the British in New Orleans than fight the Bell Witch." After this incident, John's youngest daughter, Betsy, became romantically involved with a childhood friend named Joshua Gardiner. They were deeply in love and they were engaged to be married later that year. But for whatever reason, the spirit detested this. She would begin physically attacking Betsy and Joshua, leading them to put off the marriage in fear of what might happen to them. As the youngest daughter, John and Lucy tried desperately to protect Betsy at all costs. He was often taken to neighbors' houses at night in the hope that the spirits would not find him. However, by 1820 the spirits did not stop tormenting Betsy. So she was eventually forced to forget her fiancé, Joshua. She would later marry her former teacher, Richard Powell, and moved to Mississippi, away from the area. As the years passed, everyone in the Bell family slowed down the project except for John. The witches continued to attack him unrelentingly. Showing a strong desire to kill him during this time, John began to experience paralysis in his mouth. He had numbness and difficulty swallowing food for most of the year. As time passed, the condition worsened. In the fall of 1820 he was homeless and homeless. He became the crucible of his former self. His illness and weakness are revealed when the witch begins to physically torture him. Thinking he was truly being tortured to death. His condition eventually became so bad that he was confined to bed while John Jr. cared for him. On December 19th, John Jr. was having his father checked regularly. When he was found unresponsive in bed, John Jr. rushed to the kitchen to get some medicine from the cabinet and found that there were none. Instead, there was amazing black water. Out of curiosity to know what it is. So he tried it on a house cat, who immediately rolled over and died suddenly. The witch's voice came into her ears, gleefully as she used a large amount of black liquid to kill her father. He angrily threw the remains of the bottle into the fire, which collapsed into the fire and burned in blue flames. The next day, John succumbed to the poison and died. Even after death, the witch did not leave John alone. Her funeral caused all the villagers to panic. Make them abandon that place. Now the witch had succeeded in killing John. The rest of the Bell family gradually disappeared. It feels like less of a chore until it stops altogether. The legend of the Bell Witch has remained one of the scariest entrances in American history for generations.
Some even believe the area is still haunted as it roams the world in search of its next victim. But that will be the end of today's video. I hope you enjoy it. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to know more about the Hello Kitty murder case, click on this video here. Thank you again, see you next time.